All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Dusty. I'm one of the pastors here and want to give a special shout out to all the dads and granddads, et cetera, among you. Grateful for all you guys. And, I actually saw someone make this case. I mentioned this most Mother's Day, that Mother's Day can be one of the more dodged Sundays of the year. And, actually the attendance on Father's Day is actually a little bit lower. Now, it's summer, so you have to, I don't know if you can do for those of you that do clinical trials and all that, I don't know that we could just really necessarily break them apart. But I think that there's probably, my hunch would be, is there's a fair amount of sadness in similar ways that there would be for Mother's Day. There's all the celebration going on that's clear, but also for those that are struggling with infertility or have lost a father or have a strained relationship with a father. I think there'd be some of that. But I think one additional element is I do think there's a fair amount of shame among men about, man, I'm not measuring up with what I need to be. And so I want to pray over you and pray for us just to re-engage that role, also to just engage shame with the power of the cross, and I'm really grateful for all of you guys. So I want to pray for dads, and then we're going to jump into our time in the Bible. So Lord, thank you for just, even as I've been seeing a lot of these men streaming in today, so many good dads. I'm really grateful, and even the product of good dads, and what a gift that men that are engaged with their faith and with their sons and their daughters. What a beautiful thing. So we'll raise up more of them, even our young guys that are here and young boys, that they would become those kind of men in time. And just like we were talking about a second ago, that for those that have experienced loss and pain with a father that's no longer living, or maybe with a strained relationship, or with maybe a strained relationship with one of their children, or infertility, or shame that they feel, that you would give them what they need with some of that grief and loss, and that the power of the cross, the power of the resurrection would speak a better word for those that are feeling a sense of loss and shame, that there would be a new confidence and a new kind of engagement. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, we are in Matthew chapter 5 today, so if you've got your Bibles, you can turn there. And in just a second, we're going to start in verse 38, but I want to just talk a little bit about what we're getting at. So our topic today is we're going to be talking about, or it's really Jesus talking about it. This is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, doing this all summer long, and the topic is going to be on how you deal with people that have hurt you, or who at least you disagree with. That'd be, again, spectrum. Disagree with here, people that have really damaged you and done wrong to you here, and how you're going to interact with them. And usually what happens is when people disagree with us or have hurt us, even again more, we'll feel more intensity as it moves down the spectrum here, is that usually they're kind of dead to us, is usually how that works. And there's a lot of different ways that we might retaliate, we might punch back, that we'll do it different ways. It's some of us, our favorite tactic might be the stink eye. It might be icy silence, that there's somebody that you don't like very much, so you might pass the hallway even at church. Or it could be at a restaurant where you bump into each other, and your favorite tactic might be, look the other direction and make sure that they know that you saw them, but you're not going to give them the time of day, that kind of thing, right? So it could be that. It could be kind of passive-aggressive ways of communicating, I'm not happy with you and you've hurt me. Or it could be more aggressive, where it goes beyond stink eye and it goes to a mean word and you go tell them off. Could even be a physical confrontation. But in either way, whether, again, a spectrum of passive over here to very aggressive, direct over here, either way, that a lot of times when we've been hurt and when we've had a disagreement, that where it can often go, in fact, usually it's where it does go, if not checked, is bitterness, unforgiveness, retaliation, sometimes just being flat out mean and vindictive and talking bad about people, and it can just mark us, and it actually becomes corrosive to the soul. And as I'm saying it, surely I don't need to convince you of this, do I? That this has been a really negative force for pretty much every person in this room. And again, this isn't just adults, but you could be 13 and you've got a kid that calls you dumb at school or makes fun of what you wear or who knows what. And like that, you go right in that same spot. You're like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to work out this off season and whatever. I mean, it's like I'm going to put you in your place next year. We'll see, and with whatever means you're going to do that. I'll get the good grade or I'll get the starting spot. And we can, it's every age, all of this, that none of us are immune to it if you're a human being. And so we just tend to avoid people that have hurt us, we punch back, we retaliate. So that's on a personal level. I'd like to add one more layer to this, though, that we also have like a cultural component to this, that in addition just to human beings of all times and ages struggle with what I just said to you, we also have a really interesting cultural moment that we have in our world that we live in, and that's that sometimes people call it cancel culture. And I think sometimes we think that's only, one political persuasion does that. But the reality is it's pervasive in every way. So I'm just going to name it. So on the one hand, you'll have something like Bud Light or Target that are like, hey, I'm not shopping there, not buying that, any of that. So you'll have that on the one hand. On the other hand, you'll have a baseball player that doesn't support Pride Month, or maybe a baker that isn't going to bake a cake for a gay marriage or something like that. This is specifically in the area of sexuality, which tends to be kind of the hot topic conversation at the moment. That you'll have people that lose jobs or get sued on both sides or boycotted on the other. And here's my point to this: is that even if you're like, well, I actually agree with one of those particular courses of action on that particular issue. Trust me, my point is not to dive into these deep waters and say which things we should boycott and what things people should spend their money on and not. I'm not diving into that. My point is just raising this question. Is it possible that the way that we tend to have political dialogue and the way that we tend to deal with people we disagree with, and then again, that's culturally, but then on a personal level, the way that we tend to deal with people that have hurt us, is it possible that maybe the general environment that we live in, on top of our personal tendencies, might not be exactly what Jesus intends? Is it possible, before you get defensive about it, is it possible that we might not be living this thing out in the way that Jesus intends for us to? So if you're open to that question, that's where Jesus is going to go now. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into this. We're going to start in verse 38 of Matthew chapter 5, and we're just going to work through this a verse or two at a time, and I hope that Jesus' words here will be balm to wounds and maybe a bit of correction in a really helpful, life-giving way to all of us. So let's start verse 38. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And we're going to need to stop already, even though we haven't hardly got anywhere. We got one verse. We're going to have to stop and chat about that. So Jesus is pulling from the Old Testament. This kind of idea of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth is many places in the Old Testament. And I could just quote one. Exodus 21:24 is one of them, but there's lots of them. And the point of this a good rule, and by the way, this should remind you, if you've been here a few weeks, that we've seen the same formula for so much of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount up till now, where he'll say, hey, you've heard it said. And most of the time, he'll throw out a pretty good rule from the Old Testament. Now, that's not every time he's done that. Sometimes he'll use some sayings. But in this case, he's taking an Old Testament passage and saying, hey, you've heard it said. And he's done it with, hey, you've heard it said, don't kill anybody. Can we agree that's a really good rule? Hey, don't commit adultery. I think anyone that has been involved in a marriage knows that that's really important, and it's the bedrock of trust. Okay, so let's not kill anybody. Let's not have an affair. Let's for all but the most serious things, let's try really hard to stay married. I think everyone, even if you've been through a divorce, you would agree that that's like really good advice if you could pull it off. And so let's do these. Here's some rules here. These are good rules. There's some exceptions. There's some things we got to talk about. But here's some good general principles. But what he does on all of these is like, yeah, but you've heard it said, but then he's going to get to this deep place of the heart about that thing. And this is where he's starting here. Is he said, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And how I've heard this quoted a lot. This is one that a lot of Americans would know, although I think they tend to misquote it, because usually what will happen is if somebody's like, somebody embezzles money, you're like, hey, eye for an eye. Go take that back from them, punch back. Or if they did this crime, they should have that same thing taken away from them. But the point of the Old Testament law here is different than you might think. The point of it was knowing human nature. What the law was intended to do, among other things, is show us what God's like and what we should do for human flourishing. But it's also knowing human nature to keep us from going in ditches and keep us on the rails. So that the idea is that it's going to limit retaliation. That it's going to put an upper bounds on the kind of retaliation that you can do to someone that's hurt you. So here's the reality. If someone steals $100 from you, our tendency is not to say, I need that $100 back, but it's going to be like, I'm going to end you. You know what I mean? Like you're no longer going to be employed in this town, buddy. That kind of thing. That's what we tend to be able to do, is you take you slap me on the face and I'm going to put you in a chokehold and, that kind of thing. You're going to be tapping out if you in general breathe in my direction. And what we tend to do is, whatever happens, we bump it up a few notches and we retaliate way beyond the offense. Oh, you were rude to me? Well, I'm going to on and on, right? And so he said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, and that was there to limit retaliation, which does speak to this overall tendency we have. But now he's going to go to the deep places and say, but let's work into this space. Let's talk about not just an upper limit of what you can take from them back, but let's talk about the heart that might drive that tendency to over-retaliate. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. This is a saying that most Americans would know, turn the other cheek. And this is where it comes from, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. This would be the saying, go the extra mile. If you've ever heard that, you may have a coach, hey, we got to go the extra mile, boys, that kind of thing. Well, pulling from Jesus, how about that? So this is those sayings. But what Jesus is getting at here is he's addressing the heart, and this is not intended to be nuanced. So I need to talk about this for a second, because in the same way that Jesus is not nuancing most of these topics, although he did a bit on the divorce conversation and said, actually, there are some exceptions where divorce is going to be necessary. But here, there's not nuance, and it's not intended to be. He's speaking to retaliation and our basic inclination to punch back whenever we've been hurt or wounded or when someone disagrees with us. He's not speaking to the fact that there ought to be good boundaries and that sometimes the loving thing to do is to have good boundaries. I'll give you some examples of this. He's just not going in this direction with this very, very pointed sermon that he's got where he's addressing the heart in very focused ways. But for instance, that there might be a time if you've got a mooch for a roommate that, or maybe even an older kid that just won't launch into adulthood, that there are times where the loving thing is to say, all right, buddy, on the first, you're moving out. It's time. That time there's a loving time where you say, hey, look, we're not going to keep doing this. That we're enabling like some really immature, unhealthy that aren't even good for you. And so Jesus isn't denying that kind of thing here. Or let's say someone was in an abusive, unhealthy relationship. Maybe, and I mentioned this last week on the divorce conversation, where someone is getting screamed at. Maybe they're getting hit. Their spouse is unfaithful. That sometimes, sadly, that Christian types will give people counsel to, oh yeah, you just need to keep taking that for sure, and just trust Jesus with it all. That I don't think that Jesus is saying that we need to put ourselves in unhealthy, unsafe situations and keep turning the other cheek literally to an abuser. I don't think that's what Jesus is getting at either. Like, we need to get you safe. I think that you see that in other ways in Jesus in the New Testament, the Old Testament. I think that in general the Bible isn't denying that at all. Jesus isn't denying that. Sometimes boundaries are love and they're for safety and protection, all right? But what he is getting at, though, is this is really a single topic, and he's talking about retaliation and our tendency to punch back. That's what he's zeroing in on, not a denial of boundaries, but zeroing in on personal retaliation when we want to take them down for hurting us and letting bitterness consume us. So Jesus is trying to say, hey, the minimum standard is set, the limits are set, but let's talk about the heart. I'd add one more thing in addition to this that I think is important to understand contextually, is that I think it would have been true for them 2,000 years ago about that we tend to have a very high value on our personal rights. But if it was true 2,000 years ago, how much more true is it for us now as Americans, 1, Texans, 2, Lubbockites, 3. I mean, you got to keep in mind what our heritage is out here. These are people that moved out here where there's no water pretty much at all, except down, no trees, no nothing. You're like, perfect. You know what I mean? Like right here, X marks the spot. This is where we're gonna turn ground right here. Yeah, but Dad, there's no water. Shh, it's gonna be fine. Yeah, but we're a long way from help. We don't need it. That kind of thing. Like that's our heritage, and we have a high premium on our rights. okay? And so the thing is, and again, this isn't nuanced, all that Jesus is saying. There is a time to stand up for rights. There is a time to push back against injustice. There's a time whenever you push back against tyrannical force, all of that, yes, all right? This isn't intended to be nuanced. But again, can we agree that we might have an unhealthy obsession with our personal rights? And that can be masqueraded with just pride of nobody telling me nothing, and you ain't telling me what to do, and if you offend me, you're dead, and everything else, right? That one time I heard a guy talk about when he was hearing missionaries talk about life in the East, like in the Middle East and even in Asia, and they're talking about how it's an honor-shame culture, and then he realized, oh wait, this is Alabama. You know what I mean? This is Texas. It's like if you say something bad about me or I'm going to slap you with a white glove and go to paces, basically. You know what I mean? That we are easily offended, and we just have to acknowledge the fact that we might have an overinflated sense and a awareness of our own rights in a way that might be unhealthy, overgrown, even a sense of ego, and where we're looking to get even if we have even the slightest inclination that we've been shamed or dishonored. And I think we have to be aware of it, all right? So Jesus is focusing on retaliation, and he's about to go to another step here, all right? So next step here in verse 43, so he's saying, look, we're gonna turn the other cheek. There might be some times where we deny some of our rights, where we're wronged even. The scripture speaks to that, where we're even going to open ourselves up to maybe somebody taking advantage of us a little bit. There's some times where that might not be wise, but where we are like, man, we could just take this one on the chin and trust Jesus with this. There are times where we could do that, and it'd be a worshipful thing. Verse 43, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, this wouldn't be from the Bible. I want to be really clear. Most of the time, that's what Jesus has been doing. He's like, hey, you've heard it said, tooth for a tooth, eye for an eye. You've heard it said, don't kill anybody. You've heard it said, don't have an affair. Well, this one actually isn't from the Bible. This would be just a contemporary saying that would be kind of honestly pretty similar to one we have. Right now, it might be love your people, love your people, forget the haters, that kind of thing. And it might be something along those lines. He said, hey, you've heard it said, love your people, forget the haters. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So, man, that one right there is, you want to talk about something where our whole cultural values get turned on their head in one of Jesus' sayings. That there's some things that Jesus would say that our culture values that you're like, oh man, yeah, that's great. And we even have a biblical foundation for why it is the way we are, and it could be a beautiful thing. But there are some times when especially you have a honor-shame cultural imprint, and you are easily offended, and you have an overinflated sense of your own rights and your own personhood, and you like to burn it down when you're offended, either passively or aggressively, doesn't really matter. And what we tend to do is be like, man, I've got my people. We even tend to do this in Christian community, where what a lot of us are looking for in connection with a church is you're looking for a few people, 3 or 4 good friends, nothing wrong with that. But effectively keep the people you don't like out, find a few of my people, click it up, and then be good, and then kind of keep everybody else at arm's length or even more. But here's the thing. I'm just going to throw this out here as a thought. Like, think about some of the world's most awful people. I mean, whoever that is for you. I mean, Hitler is an easy one to pick because everybody doesn't like Hitler for good reason, right? But I bet Hitler had his crew. I bet he did. I bet he and Göring, Goebbels, all those kind of guys, Hess, I bet they felt like, they're like, man, this is my guys right here. I mean, I bet they even had a sense of love for each other and trust for each other in that little room. And there's nothing distinctively Christian about you having your people. Nothing distinctly Christian about that. Now, where it starts to get distinctly Christian is not that you've got 4 or 5 people that you like, that you look out for in your family, and the claws come out if somebody messes with your family. Okay, that is a human experience. The thing that becomes countercultural and unique is when you love your enemies and you pray for those who persecute you. That's whenever it becomes really distinct. And I have a challenge for you, and I'd like for you to consider it right now. Would you consider, and this would be a time, if you want to just act like you're doing it and text somebody, this is a good chance to get caught up on your grocery list and order some food or whatever, but I have a challenge. Would you consider taking the next 30 days, setting an alarm in your phone every day at a certain time? You could do it at, 5:43 p.m., so that's Matthew 5:43. You could do it whatever you want to do, whatever digital means you need of reminding you. But I want you to think of a person that would fit in the category of enemy for you. It might be that mean girl at school. It might be that business relationship that went sour. It might be somebody that left your small group and said bad things about you. Or I don't know. I don't know what that is for you. But I bet you don't have to think very hard, do you, about someone that would fit in this category? I challenge you, even if you're like, dude, this is my abuser, okay? I challenge you. I'm not saying you need to go be friends or even go have a conversation with your abuser. Probably shouldn't. But I'm saying, would you commit for 30 days to pray for an enemy every day? Pray for them. I mean, these are Jesus' words, and he's saying, you've heard it said, love your people, hate the haters. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Nothing will tenderize your own heart. Nothing will address bitterness in the soul quite like praying for the flourishing of someone that's hurt you. Nothing will do it like that. For someone that's disappointed you, for someone that's let you down, someone that's hurt you, someone that you disagree with. Would you be willing to pray for someone politically that you just can't really stand? I mean, would you pray, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, pray for Joe Biden, pray for Donald Trump? Would you do that? If that's the ones that just stand out to you, one of those. I don't know who that would be for you. But to really consider praying where you might have boundaries and we're not even implications for love, but something to sink into the soul and pray for the flourishing and pray for good things to happen in that person's life and soul, even if they've done evil things up until now. Pray for your enemies. Think about Jesus up on the cross. Think about Jesus on the cross. They are mocking him. They're gambling over his clothes. He's up there naked, and the only possessions he actually has in the moment, they're gambling for him. They're making fun of him. They're mocking him. Hey, if you're the Son of God, why don't you, all this. They're doing all this. And he's like, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, and he's praying for his enemies, like right there as he's dying. So if you want to know what God is like, Jesus isn't asking you to walk in something that he hasn't himself done. Like he knows what it's like to be you, and he knows what it's like to have had someone that saw COVID differently than you or whatever. He knows what that's like, and he's inviting you into a path of life and freedom. Last few verses. So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, all right? What that means is, like this is a bit of a wake-up call, and this means this is not optional, all right? Y'all, seriously, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven means this is what people of grace do. Those who've been transformed by the cross and the resurrection, that have received grace from God, don't get to say, I'm going to take these things from the Bible I like, but I'm going to forget the fact that I've got contempt towards my brothers and sisters, and I'm just going to let that harbor. I'm going to let unforgiveness and bitterness be unchecked because that's like extra credit, and I don't want to deal with that, and I hate their guts, and they've wronged me, and plus, their laundry list of things that they've done, and this is how marriages toxify. It's all this, is that so that you may be sons and daughters of our Father who's in heaven. It's like we're here to imitate him, and our Father is full of grace, and we imitate him in giving grace and loving and praying for those who wrong us. Again, that doesn't imply relationship, doesn't mean you should go back into business with someone that wasn't trustworthy or that did you wrong or whatever, but we're talking about you and your basic inclination to punch back and to retaliate and to harbor bitterness. And to make us this point, that next part of the verse, of verse 45, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. I was really confused by this sentence until I had a commentator help me think through it. And what he's saying is that, hey, look, there are terrible, terrible, wicked people that get to enjoy beautiful West Texas sunsets. Wicked, wicked people have people that they love, and they get to enjoy love. They get to enjoy maybe a healthy and good marriage. Wicked people get to enjoy a ribeye, chips and queso, and catching a trout on a dry fly and whatever. I mean, like there are awful, awful people that get to see the Grand Tetons and Grand Canyon and Palo Duro Canyon, which is a gem. You need to go see if you haven't. And his point is that God does good things even to wicked people that haven't honored him, that haven't responded to him as creator. God does good things to them. So the implication is if the sun rises on the evil and the good, that if God shows kindness towards wicked people that have rejected him wholly, if that's true, then what are the implications for how you treat someone that has dishonored, has hurt you? What are the implications? So we're sons and daughters of our Father in heaven, and we imitate him in these ways. Last few verses, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? That's what everybody does. Everybody loves their people. Do not even the tax collectors do the same? No shade here, CPAs. This is a very specific group of people that did everything from embezzle to propped up the occupying forces of the Romans. And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So don't let the perfect part trip you up. What it's saying is look, our aim is not what everybody else is doing and what everybody else thinks is fine. Our aim is to be like God. And we can know what God is like from the Bible, and we can see it in Jesus. And so that's our aim. Our desire is that's our goal right there. And we want to obey him everywhere that he leads us, even when it's hard and even whenever we've been really let down in the past. So here's the deal. I need you to know this. Like, this is one of these sermons that's so easy to be like, oh man, this is going to be incredible from here on forward. Here's the deal. Christians are going to have conflicts. Church is like a really weird world. It really is. That you have people, and you can, even in churches, you're going to have conflict. And you're going to have people are all the time unhappy with their churches. And you're like, oh, how did you know? But I mean, I was just over at some family members' house that don't live in Lubbock the other day, and almost all of them were unhappy with their churches that they go to in the Metroplex. And in general, that you can have people unhappy with how things are, unhappy with people with their churches. You're going to have Christians that may even go to the same church, or maybe not, but they're Christians that are in business together, and it goes really sideways, and they hate each other's guts. You'll have people that will get in divorces, and some people side with this person, and some people side with this person, and then like everybody leaves the church. You'll have conflicts and a dispute where something happens that ends up almost going physical, and people don't want to be around each other because of hurt feelings. And look, I just need you to know this, like, it's messy. And not only has it been messy in the past, but we're going to have disagreements, and things are not going to go as planned in the future too. But what Jesus is offering here is a pathway, not a way to prevent conflict, because that's not going to happen. But what he is doing is saying, look, I want to talk about the heart. I want to go to the deep place in the same way he did with, hey, you heard it said, don't kill anybody and don't have an affair. But I want to talk about the lust. I want to talk about the anger. I want to talk about the heart behind us following through on our commitments. And here he's saying, I want to talk about our tendency to retaliate and the ugly places that can be there. So to conclude, I want to finish with a story about a guy named Greg. So Greg was the senior pastor of really my first full-time church I worked at. I'd worked for a couple of other churches part-time. And truthfully, when I started working for Greg as his youth guy, which is still my dream job. I tell Des all the time that he's got my dream job here at Redeemer. So, which, by the way, they go to youth camp in a couple of weeks. We have a great youth ministry. And I was youth guy, and the truth is I was probably never a very good fit for this church from the very beginning. I mean, so a little bit about me. I'm from Fort Worth, so I'm a city kid, and I come to Texas Tech, and that's really where my spiritual life took off, was whenever I really couldn't stand the church, which is funny that I'm a pastor now. But anyhow, I came here, and I was involved with, it doesn't sound like progressive methodologically to you, but I was involved with a really kind of cutting edge college ministry at the time at Indiana Avenue Baptist Church here in town. And there's a guy named Russ Murphy that had started a college ministry that had its own college service. A guy named John Randalls was a pastor. He's no longer alive now, but both those guys actually had a really big impact on me. But they had like a band, and a pastor that wasn't in a coat and tie, and you're like, whoa, those, like, my kids now are like, but in 1990, that was a really big deal when I showed up at Texas Tech. And so that was like even like how I kind of cut my teeth into the church, really, in a lot of ways. And it was a really incredible experience. And I took a job for a couple of years part-time at another church. And then I take this job full-time. And it's a 70-year-old church in a 3A town in a rural community. And you can almost see like, is this really a good idea? I would add, here's some things I didn't say. So like I'm different, in terms of my background. But another thing is I'm also proud and I'm arrogant and think I'm more spiritual than everybody else and have an incredible lack of wisdom at 23 when I go there. And stuff like, just dumb stuff, like changing the youth camp they'd been going to for 20 years in a matter of a month, things like that, and you're like, why did you do that? I don't know. Thinking that maybe God was going to raise me up to be a change agent at this church at the ripe old age of 23, and that I was going to help all these old folks really love Jesus. And if you know that you really love Jesus if you sing the new song. songs, that kind of thing. And so there's like some arrogance in there and a terrible lack of wisdom. And on their end, they were very afraid of these kids that were starting to come. We had a bunch of 90s alternative rock kids, with the big jeans and the wallet chains and the purple hair and all this, and then a bunch of jocks and all that. And some of the parents weren't real happy about who was coming and all these things. And then things got to a head. I found a band in a neighboring larger town. They were going to drive out for free and like have a band on Wednesday nights. And this was going to be very new. And the pastor shut it down the night before, and I was just furious about it. We had a disciple now that we had called Revolution. Again, not the wisest thing if people are already nervous about you. And then it was based on Romans 12, 1 and 2. And then we it all completely unraveled. We had a fifth quarter thing for middle school kids after a football game. And we had like legitimately almost every middle school kid in town was at this thing. And it was like a punk ska band, 90s. And man, it was wild. And I was so hyped about it. It was so much fun. I mean, there were kids bouncing around on pews and all this. And I was right in the middle of it in the mosh pit. I thought it was the most incredible night ever. We got to share the gospel with them. But I could see like all the parents, including the pastor's wife, were all in the back row with their arms crossed, not thinking it was as cool. Next day I get called in the office, and it was like, hey, basically, this isn't working at all. And I ended up resigning. A matter of a week later, my dad dies. We're become full-time guardians of my 14-year-old brother. I think he might have been 15 at that time. Man, I was bitter. I mean, I hated Greg down to the core of my being. I really did. Like, how can a pastor, and I just stewed on that for years. I really did. Like, if I would have seen him someplace, they actually came to my dad's funeral, and I politely shook their hands, but I kind of wish they wouldn't have, stuff like that. And so it stayed that way, and I ended up moving to Lubbock in 99, and then my wife starts med school. I start working at Southcrest Baptist as a college guy. And it's almost like I needed a couple of years to kind of stabilize my life a little bit. And what was interesting is over time, my attitudes toward Greg started to change, started to pray for Greg. I began to be maybe a little bit aware of some of the things I just said to you about, wait a second, maybe it wasn't just all Greg. Maybe I was really unwise, maybe not a good fit, and arrogant. Is that possible? And so one day, Greg reached out to me. This is probably 4 or 5 years after the fact. And he said, hey, can we get on the phone sometime? And I said, sure. And he calls and he says, hey, I just wanted to tell you that, and he began to be specific on his end of the equation as I didn't know what you were trying to do. Now, like he actually moved to a church in Dallas too. And he said now like every youth group in like Dallas County has a band, I just didn't understand it, and I was afraid, and that was ridiculous, and also was really afraid of what parents were saying about some of the kids that were coming, and that was wrong and even sinful of me, and I wasn't wise about how I handled your dad's, like death that was coming, and I hope that you'll forgive me for those things. And it's obvious that the Lord had been working in his heart over those several years, and I was able to forgive him. And then I began to tell him some of the things I just told you about my lack of wisdom, sinfulness, and even that I was sorry because so there are families that left the church when I left, that surely was hurtful for me. He probably hated me in a lot of ways too. And now, what's funny now, whenever I think about enemies, Greg doesn't even come to mind at all. Like he's not even anywhere on the radar. In fact, if I were to see him, I would go have lunch with him. If I was in the same town as him, I'd go sit down and have a cup of coffee with a guy. So here's my hope for you, and this is where we're going to go right now in prayer, is that you may not ever need to have that phone call. Again, I don't know your story. Maybe you do. Some of us have some just petty grudges we're holding. And listen, y'all, this is not optional. The Lord wants to go right here, right now. So that's what I'm going to lead us into in prayer right now. So let's do some work, all right? I want you to get that person in your mind. Pick one enemy. And I want you to pray for them right now, for God to do good to their soul, to work, that there would be a flourishing. And you could pray for there to be an ownership of areas that they harmed you on. But I want you to pray for God to do good things to them, to work good things in their soul. Ask him to address your bitterness and lack of forgiveness as well. And if it's been ugly and vindictive, why don't you just confess that? Ask for forgiveness and walk in grace. Lord, would you work powerfully among your people right now, that there would be bondage that would be removed, even if relationship couldn't be wise or advisable, that you release from unforgiveness, from bitterness, from meanness, that we would love our enemies in a way that's completely countercultural. Even our public dialogue would be different, less angsty, less retaliatory, even with people that are political opponents, that there be something new and unique and beautiful that would mark your people. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.